Picture this. You've been saving every penny for 5 years, working double shifts and skipping vacations, watching your dream wedding fund grow to $80,000. You can practically taste the perfect day you've planned down to the last detail. Then you discover your parents secretly withdrew $75,000 of your money to buy your sister a house, and they expect you to just smile and be happy for her. What would you do? Would you confront them immediately, or would you plot the most calculated revenge that would teach them the true cost of betrayal? I'm Emma, and this is exactly what happened to me 6 months ago. What I did next shocked everyone, including myself, and changed our family forever. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of our downtown Austin loft as I sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor, surrounded by wedding magazines and vendor contracts. Michael was at his engineering firm pulling another late night on the infrastructure project that had consumed his last 3 months. I loved these quiet moments alone, planning what would be the most important day of our lives. My laptop balanced on my knees as I logged into our joint savings account to transfer another deposit to the wedding venue coordinator. The screen loaded, and my heart stopped. Where there should have been $80,000, the number staring back at me read $5,000 and change. I refreshed the page 3 times, convinced the bank's website was glitching. The balance remained the same. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the transaction history, and there it was. A withdrawal for $75,000 made just 4 days ago. The memo line read, Johnson Family Trust, Real Estate Investment. I had never heard of any family trust. Michael and I were the only ones with access to this account, or so I thought. My breathing became shallow as I grabbed my phone and called the bank's customer service line. After navigating through an endless menu of options, I finally reached a human being who confirmed my worst nightmare. The withdrawal had been authorized by a secondary account holder, Linda Johnson, my mother. Apparently, when I opened the account at 18, still naive and trusting, I had added her as an emergency contact with full access privileges, something I had completely forgotten about until this moment. The customer service representative explained that the funds had been transferred to another account under the same family name. My stomach churned as the pieces began forming a horrifying picture. I hung up and immediately called Michael. He answered on the first ring, his voice tired but warm. When I explained what I had discovered, the silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, he spoke, his voice tight with controlled anger he rarely displayed. He told me he would leave work immediately and be home within the hour. I spent those 60 minutes pacing our apartment, alternating between rage and disbelief. The sound of Michael's key in the lock felt like salvation. He found me standing by our kitchen island, still clutching printouts of the bank statements I had frantically downloaded. Without a word, he wrapped me in his arms, and for the first time since discovering the theft, I allowed myself to cry. Not the delicate tears of a disappointed bride, but the raw, ugly sobs of someone whose trust had been shattered by the people who were supposed to protect her. When I finally composed myself enough to speak, we sat together and pieced through the evidence. The timeline was damning. 4 days ago was the same day Rachel had posted photos on Instagram of herself holding house keys, grinning beside a stunning 2-story home in Westlake Hills with the caption, "Dreams do come true, our first house." The same day my parents had called to congratulate her on the surprise inheritance that made the down payment possible. Michael pulled up the property records on his laptop while I scrolled through Rachel's social media posts. The house had sold for $400,000, requiring a 20% down payment of exactly $80,000. But the bank records showed only $75,000 had been withdrawn from my account. The missing $5,000 suddenly made sense when I found Rachel's Venmo payments from that week. Furniture shopping, decorating supplies, and a celebration dinner at Austin's most expensive steakhouse. As we sat in our living room, surrounded by the evidence of my family's betrayal, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The little sister who had always been expected to share, to sacrifice, to put family harmony above her own needs, began to dissolve. In her place, someone harder and more determined was emerging. Someone who had learned that trust, once broken, required consequences to heal. Michael watched me carefully as I closed the laptop with deliberate calm. He knew me well enough to recognize the dangerous quiet that had settled over me. This wasn't the explosive anger he might have expected. This was something colder, more calculated. I had been saving for this wedding since I was 22 years old, working overtime at the marketing firm, taking freelance projects on weekends, saying no to vacations and shopping trips that my friends took for granted. Every dollar in that account represented a sacrifice I had made for our future together. Every late night spent working on additional client projects instead of watching movies with Michael. Every time I had chosen the cheaper option at restaurants while Rachel ordered whatever she wanted, knowing our parents would cover her expenses. Every birthday and Christmas where I had given thoughtful, expensive gifts while receiving token presents in return because Emma doesn't need much, she's so practical. The worst part was realizing this wasn't impulsive. The withdrawal required planning, coordination between my parents and Rachel. They had sat around our family dinner table just last Sunday, listening to me excitedly discuss final wedding preparations, knowing they had already stolen the money that would make it possible. They smiled and nodded and asked detailed questions about the venue, the catering, the flowers, all while my dream wedding fund was already in Rachel's real estate lawyer's escrow account. I thought about the conversation we had shared just 2 weeks ago when Rachel had mentioned casually that she and Kevin were still looking for their first home, how she had sighed dramatically about Austin's competitive real estate market and how impossible it seemed for young couples to get ahead. I had actually felt sorry for her, knowing that Kevin's job, the marketing agency, barely covered their current rent, much less a down payment on a house. Now I understood that the performance had been carefully orchestrated. Rachel's wistful comments about homeownership, my parents' concerned expressions about their daughter's housing situation, the subtle hints that family should help family during difficult times. They had been laying the groundwork for weeks, maybe months, preparing me psychologically to accept whatever justification they would eventually offer for their theft. But they had made one crucial miscalculation. They assumed I would discover the missing money gradually, perhaps when making a payment to a vendor, giving them time to craft their explanation and appeal to my ingrained desire to keep the family peace. They never expected me to stumble across the theft immediately, while the transaction was still fresh in the bank's records, while Rachel's celebratory social media posts provided a clear timeline of their deception. As I sat there, absorbing the full scope of their betrayal, I made a decision that would change everything. I wouldn't confront them immediately. I wouldn't give them the opportunity to gaslight me to minimize their actions, or to turn this into another situation where Emma was expected to be understanding and forgiving. Instead, I would investigate. I would gather evidence, and then I would respond in a way that ensured this would never happen to me again. Michael reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine. He didn't try to talk me out of whatever plan was forming in my mind. He simply squeezed gently and said the words I needed to hear. "Whatever you decide to do, I'm with you completely." In that moment, I knew that regardless of what happened with my family, I had chosen the right person to build a life with. Someone who saw my worth, who respected my boundaries, and who wouldn't ask me to sacrifice my dignity for the sake of keeping others comfortable. The sun was setting over Austin's skyline, casting long shadows across our apartment floor. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of uncovering exactly how deep this betrayal went. Tonight, I would hold on to the last few hours of my old life before everything changed forever. Part 2. The historical context. Sleep eluded me that night, as memories I had carefully buried began surfacing with painful clarity. Michael lay beside me, his steady breathing a comforting rhythm in the darkness. But my mind raced through years of incidents I had dismissed as normal family dynamics. Now, with the theft of my wedding fund casting everything in a harsh new light, I could see the patterns that had been invisible to me before. The first major incident happened when I was 16. I had been working part-time at a local boutique after school, saving every paycheck for a car. Not just any car, but a reliable used Honda that would give me independence and help me get to my job at the market.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Marketing internship I had lined up for senior year. After 8 months of dedication, skipping movies with friends and brown bagging lunch every day, I had accumulated $3,000. It felt like a fortune to my teenage self. Rachel, then 14, had been struggling academically and socially.
She had fallen into a group of girls whose parents could afford private tutoring, designer clothes, and expensive extracurricular activities. The pressure to fit in had become overwhelming for her, and she had started acting out at home, throwing tantrums that left our mother exhausted and our father frustrated. During one particularly dramatic evening, Rachel had locked herself in her bedroom, sobbing about how she was the only one in her friend group who couldn't afford the summer theater camp that everyone else was attending. The camp cost $2,500 for 6 weeks, money our parents claimed they didn't have available after some unexpected home repairs. I still remember the family meeting that followed, held in our living room with the formal tone that meant serious decisions were being made. Dad had explained that Rachel was at a crucial developmental stage, and that this opportunity could change her entire trajectory. Mom had talked about how important it was for siblings to support each other, especially when one was struggling. They never directly asked me to give up my car fund. Instead, they presented it as a temporary loan that would be paid back before I needed the car for my senior year internship. They painted a picture of family unity, of how proud they would be to have daughters who looked out for each other. At 16, desperate for my parents' approval and genuinely concerned about Rachel's happiness, I had handed over the money willingly. Rachel never went to the theater camp. 2 weeks before it was supposed to start, she announced she had changed her mind and wanted to spend the summer with her friends instead. The money, they explained apologetically, had already been spent on other family expenses that had come up unexpectedly. By the time senior year arrived and I needed transportation to my internship, they helped me secure a loan for a much less reliable car that broke down regularly and cost me hundreds in repairs throughout college.
Claimed they couldn't afford this expense due to other financial commitments. Once again, a family meeting was called to discuss creative solutions. This time, they didn't even pretend it would be a loan. Instead, they appealed to my sense of responsibility as the successful daughter who had clearly inherited their work ethic and academic drive. They suggested that since my scholarship covered most of my tuition, I was in a better position to help than they were. They reminded me how much they had sacrificed to give both Rachel and me opportunities, and how family members support each other during difficult times. I gave them $4,000 that semester, money I had earned serving coffee at 6 in the morning before my classes and staying late to clean equipment after most students had gone to bed. The tutoring did help Rachel's grades improve enough to get into a decent state university, though not the prestigious programs she had originally hoped for. Our parents were grateful and proud, frequently mentioning to relatives and family friends how wonderful it was to have a daughter like me who cared so much about her sister's future. What they never mentioned was how I had to pick up additional shifts during winter break, working 40 hours a week at a retail job while my friends vacationed with their families. They never talked about how I lived on ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches for months to rebuild my savings account. They never acknowledged that my sacrifice had enabled Rachel to coast through her problems without facing real consequences for her choices. The pattern continued through college and into my early 20s. When Rachel needed a security deposit for her first apartment, I provided it because her parents were tied up in investments at the moment. When she totaled her car and needed funds for a replacement, my emergency savings account was volunteered because her insurance payout wouldn't be processed for several weeks. When she and Kevin decided to take an expensive vacation to celebrate their engagement, they somehow ended up using my credit card for the hotel because theirs had been temporarily frozen due to suspected fraud. Each incident was presented as an emergency, a one-time situation that required immediate family support. Each time, I was the designated solution because I was responsible, because I planned ahead, because I lived within my means. My careful financial habits were turned into obligations to fund my sister's impulsive decisions, and my parents enabling her behavior. Looking back now, I could see how they had trained me to prioritize family harmony over my own financial security. Any hesitation on my part was met with emotional manipulation about the importance of family loyalty. Any attempt to set boundaries was reframed as selfishness or a failure to understand how much they had done for me over the years.
They had created a system where my success was automatically redistributed to solve Rachel's problems, ensuring that I could never get too far ahead while she never had to face the full consequences of her choices. The most insidious part was how they had convinced me that this dynamic was normal, even admirable. They praised me constantly for being so generous, so mature, so different from other young people who were selfish with their money. They made me feel special for being the daughter they could count on, the one who always stepped up when family needed help. They had weaponized my desire for their approval and my genuine love for Rachel, turning these positive emotions into tools for financial manipulation. As I lay in bed next to Michael, finally seeing these patterns clearly for the first time, I felt a mixture of rage and grief wash over me. Rage at the years of manipulation, at the opportunities I had missed because my money was constantly being redirected to solve other people's problems. Grief for the naive young woman who had believed that family love meant endless financial sacrifice, who had never learned that healthy relationships require reciprocity and respect for boundaries. The theft of my wedding fund wasn't an isolated incident or a desperate emergency decision. It was the latest iteration of a system that had been operating for over a decade, a system that treated my earnings as a family resource rather than my personal property. They had become so comfortable with this arrangement that they no longer even asked my permission before taking what they needed. But this time was different. This time, they had stolen from something that wasn't just about me. They had stolen from my future with Michael, from the wedding that represented our commitment to building a life together based on mutual respect and partnership. They had taken money that belonged to both of us, that we had planned and saved for together. They had violated not just my trust, but our trust as a couple. I thought about all the conversations Michael and I had shared about our families, how I had always painted my parents as loving but occasionally misguided, how I had explained Rachel's financial struggles as temporary setbacks that any caring sister would want to help resolve. Now I wondered what he really thought about the constant emergencies that seemed to require my financial intervention. Had he noticed the pattern that I had been blind to? Had he been waiting for me to recognize what was happening, respecting my autonomy enough to not interfere, but hoping I would eventually set boundaries? The digital clock on my nightstand read 3:30 in the morning when I finally gave up on sleep. I slipped quietly out of bed and padded to our kitchen, where I made a cup of tea and sat at our small dining room table with my laptop. If I was going to understand the full scope of their betrayal, I needed to document everything systematically. I opened a new spreadsheet and began listing every financial transaction I could remember, every time my money had been borrowed or invested or temporarily redirected for family needs. The numbers were staggering. Over the past 8 years, I calculated that I had given or loaned my family over $30,000, not including the recent theft of my wedding fund. $30,000 that could have paid for graduate school, could have been a down payment on a house, could have been invested for retirement. $30,000 that had simply vanished into the black hole of Rachel's poor financial decisions and my parents enabling her behavior. More than the money, what hurt was the realization that I had never been seen as an individual with my own dreams and goals. I had been viewed as a resource, a problem-solving mechanism that could be activated whenever Rachel needed help. My achievements in school and work hadn't been celebrated for their own sake, but valued for how they positioned me to support other family members. My responsible financial habits weren't respected as personal choices, but
treated as qualifications for mandatory family service. As dawn began to break over Austin's skyline, I closed the laptop and finished my tea. The evidence was overwhelming, but evidence alone wouldn't solve this problem. I needed a strategy that would not only address the immediate theft of my wedding fund, but also establish permanent boundaries that would prevent this pattern from continuing. I needed to find a way to recover what had been stolen while sending a clear message that Emma, the family ATM, was permanently out of service. The old Emma would have called her parents immediately, expressing hurt and confusion, hoping for an explanation that would somehow make this betrayal understandable. She would have accepted their justifications and found a way to make peace with being violated, prioritizing family harmony over personal justice. But that Emma no longer existed. In her place was someone who understood that love without boundaries isn't love at all, but manipulation disguised as affection. Someone who knew that enabling destructive behavior doesn't help anyone, least of all the person being enabled. Someone who was finally ready to fight for her own future, even if it meant risking relationships that had never been as genuine as she had believed. Part 3. The False Setup. Sunday dinner at the Johnson family home had been a tradition for as long as I could remember. Every week, Michael and I would drive the 20 minutes from downtown Austin to my parents' house in Lakewood, where Mom would have prepared an elaborate meal that somehow always included Rachel's favorite dishes and accommodated her latest dietary restrictions. These gatherings were supposedly about family bonding, but I was beginning to understand that they served a more calculated purpose. The morning after my sleepless night of discovery, my phone buzzed with a text from Mom that felt different somehow, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. The message was longer than her usual brief communications, filled with unusual enthusiasm about the upcoming dinner. She mentioned that she had exciting news to share and hoped both Michael and I could arrive a bit earlier than usual because she wanted to discuss something important with the whole family. Michael noticed my tension as we drove through the familiar tree-lined streets of my childhood neighborhood. I had told him about my late-night calculations and the patterns I had finally recognized, but I hadn't yet shared my suspicions about what today's exciting news might entail. Part of me hoped I was wrong, that maybe this dinner would be different, that maybe they had called this gathering to confess their theft and explain how they plan to make things right. The Johnson family home sat on a corner lot. A modest 2-story house with the kind of manicured lawn that required constant attention and significant expense to maintain. Dad's new truck sat in the driveway, a purchase he had made just 6 months ago despite their repeated claims of financial constraints. Mom's car, a luxury SUV she had upgraded last year, sparkled in the afternoon sun. Looking at these symbols of their comfortable lifestyle, I felt my anger reignite as I remembered all the times they had pleaded poverty when I was asked to fund family emergencies. Rachel and Kevin were already there when we arrived. Their presence was indicated by Kevin's motorcycle parked on the street. Through the front window, I could see Rachel animated in conversation with Mom, her hands gesturing enthusiastically in the way they did when she was excited about something. The scene looked so normal, so perfectly typical of our family gatherings that for a moment I almost convinced myself I had imagined the theft entirely. But the bank statements were real, saved on my phone and backed up to the clown. The timeline was indisputable. The money was gone, and everyone in that living room knew exactly where it had gone except for Michael and me. Mom answered the door with an unusually bright smile and an immediate hug that lasted longer than normal. She was wearing the dress she typically reserved for special occasions, and her hair had been styled more carefully than usual. Dad appeared from the kitchen wearing his best casual shirt, the one he usually saved for important family photos. Even Kevin had dressed up more than his typical Sunday standard. The whole scene felt staged, like they were all playing carefully rehearsed roles in a performance I wasn't supposed to recognize. We gathered in the living room where Mom had set out her good china plates with appetizers that clearly hadn't come from the grocery store deli counter. The coffee table held an expensive bottle of champagne that I recognized as the same brand they had served at Rachel's wedding 5 years ago. Every detail suggested this was a celebration, though what exactly we were celebrating remained unclear. Small talk felt forced as we waited for whatever announcement was coming. Dad asked about Michael's engineering project with the kind of detailed interest he usually didn't show. Mom complimented my recent haircut multiple times, something she had never done before since she typically preferred longer styles. Rachel showed us photos from her new house on her phone, describing each room with the enthusiasm of someone who couldn't quite believe her good fortune was real. The photos were stunning. Hardwood floors throughout, granite countertops in a kitchen that was twice the size of my apartment's, a master bedroom with a walk-in closet that could have housed a small family.
The backyard featured a pool and outdoor kitchen setup that looked like something from a home and garden magazine. This wasn't a modest starter home for a young couple beginning their lives together. This was a luxury property that would have required years of saving and excellent credit to obtain. As Rachel continued her virtual tour, I found myself calculating the monthly payments on a $400,000 mortgage. Even with a significant down payment, Kevin's salary from the marketing agency wouldn't come close to qualifying for a loan of that size. Either they had understated his income dramatically, or there were financial resources I wasn't aware of. The arithmetic simply did not work unless someone else was providing substantial ongoing support. When the formal announcement finally came, it was Mom who took the lead, standing up with the champagne bottle and clearing her throat for attention. She began with a speech about family milestones and how proud she was of both her daughters for reaching such important stages in their lives. She talked about the joy of watching us grow into successful, independent women who are building beautiful futures with wonderful partners. The buildup felt endless, filled with the kind of sentimental language that typically preceded requests for money.
Significant sacrifices. I found myself mentally preparing for whatever financial emergency was about to be unveiled, whatever new crisis would require immediate family support. But instead of presenting a problem, Mom announced what she framed as a solution to problems I didn't know existed. She explained that after weeks of careful consideration and family discussions, they had decided to help both Rachel and me simultaneously by making what she called strategic family investments. The language was deliberately vague, couched in business terminology that made their actions sound professional and well-considered, rather than impulsive and self-serving. For Rachel, this investment had taken the form of assistance with her housing situation. Mom explained that young couples today faced unprecedented challenges in the real estate market, and that family support could make the difference between years of renting and immediate homeownership. She talked about building equity and establishing roots in the community, making it sound like they had carefully analyzed market conditions and determined this was the optimal time for intervention. For me, she continued, their investment would focus on ensuring that my wedding was everything I had dreamed of, without the financial stress that often accompanied such significant events. She talked about the importance of beginning married life without debt, about how family support during major life transitions created stronger foundations for long-term success. She made it sound like they were relieving me of a burden, rather than stealing resources I had worked years to accumulate. The champagne cork popped with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet room. Mom poured glasses for everyone while continuing her presentation, explaining how they had consulted with financial advisors and determined that combining their resources would create better outcomes for everyone involved. She used phrases like pooled family assets and coordinated investment strategy that made their theft sound like sophisticated financial planning. Rachel's role in this presentation was to provide enthusiastic support for the brilliance of their parents' plan. She talked about how grateful she was for the opportunity to build equity instead of paying rent, how the timing had worked out perfectly with Kevin's career advancement, how wonderful it was to have parents who understood the challenges facing young adults in today's economy. Her performance was flawless, hitting every note of gratitude and family loyalty that the script clearly required. Kevin's contribution was more subtle, but equally important. He played the role of the responsible son-in-law who deeply appreciated the family's support, but wanted to ensure that everyone was comfortable with the arrangement. He asked careful questions about the financial logistics, creating the impression that significant thought and planning had gone into these decisions. His performance was designed to suggest that this wasn't impulsive or one-sided, but the result of thorough family collaboration. Dad's part in the presentation focused on the practical benefits of their coordinated approach. He talked about tax advantages and investment timing, using enough financial jargon to make their actions sound sophisticated rather than predatory. He emphasized the temporary nature of the arrangements, suggesting that family resources were simply being allocated more efficiently during a period when both daughters had major expenses. Throughout this carefully orchestrated presentation, I noticed that specific dollar amounts were never mentioned.
They talked about assistance and support and family investment, without ever acknowledging that they had stolen $75,000 from my savings account. They created the impression that everything had been discussed and agreed upon in advance, that I had been consulted and had enthusiastically endorsed their plan. The most sophisticated element of their performance was how they framed my reaction before I had a chance to provide one. Mom talked about how proud she was of my generosity and maturity in supporting Rachel's homeownership dreams. Dad mentioned how wonderful it was to have daughters who looked out for each other without keeping score. Rachel expressed gratitude for having a sister who understood that family success was more important than individual accumulation. They had written my response into their script, assuming that my years of conditioning would prevent me from contradicting their narrative. They expected me to smile and nod and express happiness for Rachel's good fortune, just as I had done countless times before when my resources were redirected to solve her problems. They had calculated that my desire to avoid family conflict would override my anger about being robbed. But as I sat there listening to their elaborate justifications for theft, something crystallized in my mind with perfect clarity. This wasn't a family meeting or a collaborative discussion. This was a performance designed to gaslight me into accepting their betrayal as generous family planning. They had stolen my money first and crafted their explanations second, banking on my history of compliance to prevent any meaningful resistance. Michael's hand found mine under the table, his fingers providing steady pressure that anchored me to reality while their fictional narrative swirled around us. I could feel him waiting for my response, ready to support whatever position I took, but careful not to influence my decision. This was my family, my money, my choice about how to respond. The room fell silent as they finished their presentation, all eyes turning to me expectantly. They were waiting for my usual immediate agreement, my automatic endorsement of their plan, my grateful acceptance of their wisdom in managing family resources. The old Emma would have thanked them for their thoughtfulness and expressed joy at Rachel's good fortune. Instead, I took a slow sip of champagne and smiled with the kind of calm that comes from finally understanding the game being played. When I spoke, my voice was steady and pleasant, giving no indication of the rage burning beneath the surface. I told them how interesting their plan sounded and how much I appreciated their concern for both Rachel's housing situation and my wedding expenses. Then, I said the words that shattered their carefully constructed script. I'll need to review all the financial documentation before making any decisions about my own money. The silence that followed was electric with tension. Mom's smile faltered slightly. Dad's confidence wavered. Rachel's gratitude transformed into something sharper and more calculating. They had expected compliance, not investigation. They had counted on trust, not verification. But the old Emma who trusted without questioning was gone. In her place sat
someone who understood that family love didn't require financial martyrdom. Someone who knew that real generosity was freely given rather than secretly stolen. Someone who was finally ready to fight for her own future, regardless of how uncomfortable that fight might make everyone else in the room. Part 4. The investigation phase. The drive home from my parents' house passed in heavy silence. Michael kept glancing at me from the driver's seat, clearly wanting to discuss what had just happened, but unsure how to begin. The tension in our car was thick enough to cut, filled with all the words neither of us was quite ready to speak. When we finally pulled into our apartment complex parking garage, I felt like I could breathe properly for the first time in hours. Once inside our loft, Michael poured 2 glasses of wine while I changed out of the dress I had worn to play the role of dutiful daughter one last time. When I emerged from our bedroom in comfortable clothes, he was sitting at our kitchen table with his laptop open, already pulling up financial websites and legal resources. His engineering mind was approaching this problem the same way he tackled infrastructure projects, systematically, methodically, with careful attention to documentation and evidence. I appreciated his practical support, but I needed something more immediate and visceral. I needed to understand exactly how deep this betrayal went and how long they had been planning it. The elaborate presentation we had just witnessed wasn't improvised. It was the culmination of weeks or months of coordination between my parents and Rachel. I needed to know what other secrets they were hiding. The next morning, while Michael was at his engineering firm and I was supposedly at my marketing job, I made a decision that would have horrified the old Emma. I drove to my parents' house, knowing they would both be at work and the house would be empty. Mom had given me a key years ago for emergencies, back when I was still considered a trustworthy family member rather than a resource to be exploited. Today felt like exactly the kind of emergency that key was meant to address. The house felt different when I let myself in through the front door. The familiar sense of Mom's candles and Dad's coffee couldn't mask the sense that I was entering hostile territory rather than my childhood home. Every family photo on the walls seemed to mock me now, showing a happy family unit that had apparently been funded by systematic theft from one of its members. The living room, where we had shared countless holiday mornings, now felt like a crime scene waiting to be investigated. I started with Dad's home office, a converted bedroom where he handled their personal finances and Mom managed her real estate business. His filing system was meticulous, organized with the same attention to detail he brought to his work at the regional bank. Finding financial documents was easy. Understanding their full implications would take more time. The first discovery was a folder labeled Rachel, House Purchase, that contained far more documentation than any normal family assistance would require. Inside were copies of loan applications, credit reports, proof of income statements, and correspondence with mortgage brokers that painted a very different picture than the one they had presented yesterday. According to these documents, Rachel and Kevin had been planning this house purchase for over 6 months, working with a mortgage broker to structure a deal that required exactly the amount of money they had stolen from my account. But the most damning evidence was a series of emails between my parents and Rachel's mortgage broker, discussing something called a family gift letter. This was a legal document that would allow my parents to provide down payment assistance without it being considered a loan that would affect Rachel's debt-to-income ratio for mortgage qualification purposes. The emails made it clear that this wasn't a spontaneous decision to help Rachel, but a carefully planned scheme that had been in development since early spring. Even more troubling was the timeline revealed in these emails. The first discussion about the family gift had occurred just 3 days after Michael and I had announced our wedding plans at Easter dinner. They had heard about our wedding plans and immediately began plotting how to redirect our savings toward Rachel's home ownership goals. The theft of my wedding fund hadn't been a response to some sudden crisis. It had been premeditated from the moment they learned about our engagement. I photographed every document with my phone, creating a digital record that they couldn't delete or deny. The evidence was overwhelming, but I needed to understand the full scope of their financial manipulation. Moving to Mom's desk area, I found her computer still logged into several accounts, including her email and the family's shared financial software. Her email revealed months of correspondence with Rachel about house hunting, mortgage shopping, and closing preparations. The tone of these exchanges was conspiratorial, filled with references to handling Emma and managing the timing, that made it clear I was viewed as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a family member to be consulted. In one particularly revealing exchange from just 2 weeks ago, Rachel had expressed concern about whether I would cause problems when she discovered the money was missing. Mom's response was dismissive and confident. Emma always comes around eventually. She knows family comes first. The casual arrogance of that statement, the assumption that my compliance could be taken for granted regardless of how I was treated, crystallized something hard and cold inside my chest. They hadn't just stolen my money, they had stolen it while mocking my character and dismissing my autonomy. The financial software revealed even more disturbing patterns. My parents had been tracking my savings account balance for months, monitoring my progress toward the $80,000 goal I had shared with them in confidence. They knew exactly when I would reach the amount needed for Rachel's down payment, and they had timed their theft accordingly. This wasn't opportunistic crime. It was calculated exploitation based on inside information I had trustingly provided. But the most shocking discovery was in a subfolder labeled Emma, Future Planning. Inside were documents that made my blood run cold. They had researched the tax implications of large family gifts, investigated ways to structure ongoing financial support that would minimize their own tax burden, and even consulted with a financial advisor about creating a formal family trust that would give them legal control over funds they designated as family resources. One document was a draft letter to me, apparently intended to be presented after the house purchase was complete, explaining their new family financial policies and establishing their right to manage shared resources as the designated patriarchs and matriarchs of the Giannis family.
Coordination policy. According to this letter, they had decided that individual family members accumulating large amounts of savings was inefficient and potentially harmful to family unity. Going forward, they proposed that major financial decisions would be made collectively, with resources allocated based on family need rather than individual ownership. The letter suggested that my wedding fund was just the beginning of a new approach to family finances. They were planning to monitor and redirect my future earnings toward what they deemed appropriate family investments. They had appointed themselves as financial guardians over my adult life, apparently believing that my success gave them the right to redistribute my wealth according to their priorities. I sat in Dad's chair, surrounded by the evidence of their breathtaking arrogance and entitlement, feeling a mixture of rage and grief that threatened to overwhelm me. The parents I had loved and trusted had been planning to financially control me for the rest of my life, treating me as a resource rather than a person. The sister I had sacrificed for repeatedly had been actively participating in schemes to steal from me while expressing gratitude for my generosity. But alongside the emotional devastation, I felt something else emerging, a cold, calculating determination that surprised me with its intensity. They had made a crucial mistake in documenting their plans so thoroughly. Their meticulous record-keeping, intended to protect them legally and financially, had instead created a comprehensive record of their systematic fraud and emotional manipulation. I spent another hour photographing documents, copying email chains, and downloading financial records. By the time I left their house, I had accumulated enough evidence to expose their entire scheme and potentially pursue legal action if I chose to do so. More importantly, I had a clear understanding of how they viewed me and what they had planned for my future. The drive back to my apartment gave me time to process what I had learned and begin formulating a response strategy. The old Emma would have confronted them immediately, demanding explanations and hoping for apologies that would allow the family to heal and move forward. But that approach had never worked before, and it certainly wouldn't work now that I understood the true scope of their manipulation. Instead, I needed to respond strategically, in a way that would not only recover my stolen funds, but also establish permanent boundaries that would prevent future theft. I needed to send a message that would make them understand, once and for all, that Emma, the family ATM, was permanently closed for business. When Michael arrived home that evening, he found me sitting at our kitchen table with my laptop open and a legal pad covered with notes. The evidence I had gathered was organized into categories: theft, fraud, planning documents, and communication records. I had created a timeline showing months of premeditation and a financial analysis demonstrating the full scope of their manipulation over the years. He poured himself a drink and sat down across from me, studying the documents I had arranged across the table. His expression grew darker as he absorbed the full picture of what my family had been planning. When he finally looked up at me, his usual calm demeanor had been replaced with something harder and more protective. The conversation that followed lasted until nearly midnight. We discussed legal options, financial recovery strategies, and the emotional toll of cutting ties with family members who had proven themselves untrustworthy. Michael made it clear that he would support whatever decision I made, but he also helped me think through the long-term implications of different approaches. By the time we went to bed, I had decided on a course of action that would have been unthinkable to me just days earlier. I wasn't going to confront my family directly or appeal to their conscience. Instead, I was going to let them believe their plan had succeeded, while I quietly implemented countermeasures that would expose their theft and ensure they faced real consequences for their actions. The next morning, I began making phone calls that would change everything. I contacted the bank to file a formal fraud report, documenting the unauthorized use of my account by someone who had abused their access privileges. I scheduled a consultation with a family law attorney to understand my options for financial recovery. I reached out to a private investigator who specialized in financial crimes to help me document any evidence I might have missed. Most importantly,
I began planning my own elaborate performance, one that would make their careful script look amateurish by comparison. If they wanted to play games with my financial future, I was going to show them exactly how dangerous it was to underestimate someone who had finally learned to fight for herself. Part 5. The Full Scope Revelation. The attorney's office occupied the 15th floor of a downtown Austin high-rise, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Lady Bird Lake and the rolling hills beyond. Margaret Chen had come highly recommended by Michael's firm, specializing in financial crimes and family law, with a reputation for aggressive advocacy on behalf of clients who had been victimized by people they trusted. Her initial consultation fee was substantial, but I was past caring about the cost of protecting myself. Margaret was younger than I had expected, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that radiated from her dark eyes as she reviewed the documents I had brought. She spread my evidence across her conference table with the methodical precision of someone who had seen similar cases before, organizing the materials into categories that told a clear story of systematic financial abuse. After an hour of careful review, she leaned back in her chair and delivered an assessment that was both validating and terrifying. According to her analysis, my family's actions went far beyond simple theft. The premeditation, the documentation, the systematic nature of their manipulation qualified as what legal experts called financial elder abuse, even though I wasn't elderly. The pattern of exploitation, combined with their abuse of fiduciary trust, created grounds for both criminal charges and a civil recovery. But Margaret's most chilling observation concerned the documents I had found outlining their future plans for controlling my finances. She explained that these materials suggested they were attempting to establish what amounted to an informal conservatorship over my financial life, positioning themselves as decision makers for my earnings and assets. If they had succeeded in implementing their family financial coordination policy, I could have found myself trapped in a system where my own money was never truly under my control. The legal implications were astounding and staggering.
Staggering, but Margaret also helped me understand the practical challenges of pursuing formal legal action. Family financial abuse cases were notoriously difficult to prosecute, especially when the perpetrators were educated and financially sophisticated. Juries often struggled to understand how smart, successful adults could be victimized by their own family members. The emotional toll of a lengthy legal battle could be devastating, particularly when the defendants were people I had once loved and trusted. However, she emphasized that the strength of my documentation gave me significant leverage in pursuing alternative resolutions. The evidence I had gathered was comprehensive enough to expose their scheme completely and create serious financial and reputational consequences for them. With the right strategy, I could likely recover my stolen funds and establish permanent protection against future manipulation without enduring years of courtroom battles. Margaret recommended that I also consult with a forensic accountant to ensure I had identified all instances of financial manipulation. She suggested that patterns this sophisticated typically involve more theft than what had been immediately discovered. Her referral led me to David Park, a certified public accountant who specialized in tracing hidden assets and uncovering financial fraud in family and business contexts. David's office was less impressive than Margaret's, located in a modest business complex near the university, but his expertise quickly became apparent as he walked me through a comprehensive financial audit process. Using bank records, tax returns, and credit reports going back 5 years, he began constructing a complete picture of money flows between my accounts and my family's various financial activities. The results of his analysis were shocking, even to me, despite everything I had already discovered. Over the past 5 years, the total amount of money that had flowed from my accounts to my family's benefit was over $60,000, not including the recent $75,000 theft. This included direct transfers, credit card payments I had made on their behalf, and loans that had never been repaid. But David's most devastating finding concerned the tax implications of their financial manipulation. My parents had been claiming some of my financial contributions as tax-deductible gifts to family members, reducing their own tax burden while never informing me that my generosity was being used to subsidize their lifestyle. The forensic analysis revealed that they had essentially been double-dipping, receiving my money while also gaining tax advantages they had never disclosed to me. Even more disturbing was David's discovery of what he called financial grooming patterns in their behavior.
The timing of their requests for money consistently coincided with periods when I had achieved professional success or received bonuses at work. They had been monitoring my career progress and timing their crises to coincide with moments when I would have maximum resources available and minimum ability to refuse without seeming petty or ungrateful. David showed me a timeline he had constructed that mapped their request against my professional milestones. When I received my first promotion at the marketing firm, Rachel suddenly needed emergency dental work that insurance wouldn't cover. When I got a substantial raise 6 months later, my parents discovered unexpected home repairs that required immediate attention. When I received a performance bonus last Christmas, Kevin's motorcycle broke down and needed expensive repairs that would allow him to keep his job. The pattern was so consistent that David calculated the probability of these coincidences occurring naturally was less than 2%. They had been systematically harvesting my success, ensuring that I never accumulated enough resources to achieve true financial independence. Every step forward in my career had been immediately offset by family emergencies that required my intervention. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was evidence that they had been discussing my earning potential with people outside the family. David found email exchanges between my mother and her real estate colleagues where she had bragged about having a daughter in marketing who was very generous with family. She had apparently been positioning herself professionally as someone with access to additional financial resources through her family connections. The forensic audit also revealed that my parents' own financial situation was far more stable than they had ever indicated to me. Their mortgage was nearly paid off, they had substantial retirement savings, and they carried virtually no debt beyond normal monthly expenses. The financial emergencies that had required my intervention over the years had been manufactured rather than genuine, designed to prevent me from accumulating wealth while maintaining their comfortable lifestyle. David's final analysis included a projection of where my finances would stand today if I had never been subjected to this systematic exploitation. According to his calculations, I should have over $150,000 in savings by now, enough for a substantial down payment on a house, a fully funded wedding, and a solid foundation for my future with Michael. Instead, I was starting over with virtually nothing while my family lived comfortably on the fruits of my labor. Armed with this comprehensive financial analysis, I returned to Margaret's office to discuss strategy options. The evidence was now overwhelming, documented with the kind of precision that would be devastating in either a courtroom or a family confrontation. Margaret explained that I had several paths forward, each with different risks and potential outcomes. The nuclear option would be to file criminal charges for theft and fraud, followed by civil suits for financial recovery and damages. This approach would likely result in full financial recovery and potentially criminal consequences for my parents, but would also guarantee permanent destruction of all family relationships and years of legal proceedings that would dominate my life. A middle path would involve what Margaret called aggressive negotiation, where we would present the evidence privately and demand immediate full restitution along with formal agreements preventing future contact or financial interference. This approach would likely recover most or all of my money while avoiding public legal proceedings, but would still result in permanent estrangement from my family. The most conservative approach would be to confront them with selected evidence and attempt to negotiate a resolution that preserved some possibility of future family relationships while establishing clear boundaries. Margaret warned that this path was the least likely to result in full financial recovery and carried the highest risk of being essentially ignored or bypassed.
Significant risk that they would simply become more sophisticated in their future manipulation efforts. As I sat in Margaret's office, weighing these options while watching the Austin skyline through her windows, I realized that my decision wasn't really about legal strategy or financial recovery. It was about what kind of person I wanted to be and what kind of life I wanted to build with Michael. The old Emma would have chosen the conservative path, prioritizing family harmony over personal justice and accepting partial restitution to avoid conflict. But the person I was becoming understood that some relationships weren't worth preserving, especially when they were built on exploitation and manipulation. My family had shown me exactly how they viewed me and what they planned for my future.
They had documented their contempt for my autonomy and their intention to control my financial life indefinitely. No amount of negotiation or boundary setting would change the fundamental fact that they saw me as a resource rather than a person. I asked Margaret to prepare what she called a comprehensive exposure package, a detailed presentation of all the evidence we had gathered, organized in a way that would make their theft and manipulation undeniable. This package would include the forensic financial analysis, copies of their own planning documents, and a complete timeline of their systematic exploitation over the past 5 years. But I didn't want to simply confront them with evidence and demand restitution. I wanted to implement a strategy that would expose their behavior to the broader family and social network they cared so much about impressing. I wanted them to face the social consequences of their actions, to experience the shame and isolation they had been willing to inflict on me. Margaret helped me understand the legal boundaries of what I could and couldn't do in terms of sharing information about their financial crimes. While I couldn't make false accusations or share information obtained illegally, the documents I had photographed in their own home were admissible evidence of their planning and coordination. Their own emails and financial records could be shared with anyone I chose, including family members, friends, and professional contacts who might be interested in understanding their true character. I spent the next several days developing what I began thinking of as the exposure plan. This strategy would unfold in carefully timed phases, each designed to maximize the impact of the revelations while minimizing their ability to control the narrative or deflect blame. The goal wasn't just financial recovery, but complete accountability for their actions and permanent protection against future manipulation. Phase 1 would involve quietly securing my own financial accounts and establishing new banking relationships they couldn't access or monitor. I opened accounts at a different bank entirely, one where my parents had no professional connections or existing relationships. I changed all my passwords, updated my security questions, and removed them from any emergency contact lists where they might have access to my financial information. Phase 2 would focus on documentation and legal preparation. Margaret's team would prepare formal demand letters for restitution, along with cease and desist orders that would legally prohibit them from accessing my financial accounts or using my credit information. We would also prepare the preliminary paperwork for criminal charges and civil suits, creating legal consequences that could be triggered immediately if they refused to cooperate or attempted retaliation. Phase 3 was the most personally satisfying element of my plan. I would systematically share the evidence of their theft and manipulation with every family member, friend, and professional contact who had witnessed their years of public praise for my generosity. Cousins, aunts, uncles, family friends, church members, and professional colleagues would all receive detailed documentation of how my supposed generosity had actually been systematic exploitation. The beauty of this approach was that it would use their own words and documents to tell the story. I wouldn't need to make accusations or engage in character assassination. Their own emails discussing how to handle Emma and their own financial planning documents outlining their intention to control my money indefinitely would speak for themselves. Phase 4 would involve strategic timing of these revelations to coincide with important social and professional events in their lives. Mom's real estate firm had an annual awards banquet coming up where she was expecting to receive recognition for her sales performance. Dad's bank was hosting a community leadership dinner where he served on the organizing committee. Rachel was planning a housewarming party to show off the home she had purchased with my stolen money. Each of these events represented an opportunity for them to experience the social consequences of their actions in front of the people whose opinions they valued most. The evidence packages would be distributed to key attendees at these events, ensuring that their professional and social reputations would be permanently damaged by their own documented behavior. But the most crucial element of my plan was timing the revelations to occur simultaneously, preventing them from controlling the narrative or coordinating their responses.
Margaret's office would deliver legal documents to their home and workplaces at the same time I was sharing evidence with family and friends. By the time they realized what was happening, the information would already be in the hands of dozens of people they cared about impressing. The final phase of my plan involved complete disengagement from their attempts at explanation, reconciliation, or retaliation. Once the evidence was public and the legal processes were initiated, I would have no further direct communication with any of them. Their attempts to contact me would be referred to Margaret's office, their social media posts would be blocked, and their efforts to use other family members as intermediaries would be politely but firmly rejected. This wasn't about revenge, though I admitted to myself that there was a certain satisfaction in imagining their shock when they realized the full scope of what I had discovered and planned. This was about justice, accountability, and permanent protection against future manipulation. It was about ensuring that no one else in my extended family would ever be victimized the way I had been, and that my parents and Rachel would face real consequences for their systematic theft and emotional abuse. As I finalized the details of my exposure plan, I felt a mixture of anticipation and sadness that surprised me with its intensity. Part of me grieved for the family relationships I thought were real, for the parents I had believed loved me unconditionally, for the sister I had thought
Appreciated my sacrifices on her behalf. Those relationships had never actually existed, but losing the illusion of them still hurt in ways I hadn't expected. But alongside the grief was something stronger and more sustaining, a sense of my own power and agency that I had never experienced before. For the first time in my adult life, I was making decisions based on my own values and priorities rather than my family's expectations and demands. I was choosing justice over harmony, truth over comfort, self-respect over approval. The woman who had discovered the theft of her wedding fund just days ago would never have been capable of developing and implementing such a comprehensive strategy. But that woman had been conditioned to prioritize other people's comfort over her own well-being, to sacrifice her own interest for the sake of family peace. The person I was becoming understood that real love required mutual respect, that healthy families didn't systematically exploit their most successful members, and that some betrayals were too profound to forgive or forget. Michael found me that evening sitting on our apartment balcony, watching the sunset paint Austin's skyline in shades of gold and crimson. He joined me with 2 glasses of wine, settling into the chair beside me without speaking. We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both of us processing the magnitude of what I had discovered and what I was planning to do about it. When I finally shared the details of my exposure plan with him, he listened without interruption, asking clarifying questions but never trying to talk me out of my chosen course of action. His support was steady and unconditional, exactly what I needed as I prepared to implement the most difficult decision of my life. As darkness settled over the city, I felt a sense of calm determination that had been missing from my life for as long as I could remember. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of holding my family accountable for their actions and establishing permanent boundaries that would protect my future. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be pleasant, but it was necessary. The old Emma, who had always chosen peace over justice, was gone forever. In her place was someone stronger, someone who understood that true family love didn't require financial martyrdom, someone who was finally ready to fight for her own future, regardless of who that fight might make uncomfortable. The battle for my financial freedom and personal autonomy was about to begin, and for the first time in my life, I was confident that I had the strength and resources to win. The morning I implemented my exposure plan, Austin was experiencing one of those perfect October days that reminded me why I loved this city. The temperature was crisp but not cold, the sky was cloudless, and the autumn light had that golden quality that made everything look like it belonged in a magazine. It felt appropriate somehow that the day I reclaimed my life would be so beautiful. I had taken the entire week off from work, telling my supervisor that I was dealing with a family emergency that required my full attention. It wasn't technically a lie, though the emergency was one of my own making.
Michael had also arranged to work from home, understanding that I would need his support as the consequences of my actions began to unfold. The first phase of my plan began at exactly 9 in the morning when Margaret's office simultaneously delivered legal documents to 3 different locations. My parents received their package at home, including formal demand letters for the full $75,000 plus interest, documentation of their systematic financial fraud, and preliminary paperwork for criminal charges that would be filed if they didn't respond appropriately within 30 days. Rachel received her documents at the marketing agency where Kevin worked, ensuring that his colleagues would witness the delivery and potentially ask questions about why she was receiving legal papers at her husband's workplace. The package included evidence of her participation in the theft, her knowledge of the systematic exploitation, and her legal liability as a co-conspirator in the fraud. The third delivery went to my parents' respective workplaces. Dad's package was delivered to the regional bank where he worked as a manager, while Mom's went to her real estate firm. Both packages contained the same comprehensive evidence of their financial crimes, along with formal notifications that criminal charges were being considered. The professional implications of being investigated for theft and fraud while working in financial services and real estate would be immediate and severe. While Margaret's team was handling the legal deliveries, I began phase 2 of my plan, the systematic distribution of evidence to our extended family and social network. I had spent days crafting a detailed email that would accompany the documentation, explaining what I had discovered and why I felt compelled to share this information with people who cared about our family. The email was carefully worded to stick to facts rather than emotions, letting their own documented words and actions tell the story. I explained how I had discovered the theft of my wedding fund, described the investigation that revealed years of systematic exploitation, and included key excerpts from their own planning documents that showed their intention to control my finances indefinitely. I sent this information package to 43 people, including aunts, uncles, cousins, family friends, church members, and professional contacts who had witnessed their public praise for my supposed generosity over the years. Each recipient received the same comprehensive documentation, ensuring that my parents and Rachel couldn't control the narrative by offering different explanations to different people. The responses began almost immediately. My phone started buzzing with text messages and calls from family members who were shocked by what they were reading. Several cousins reached out to say they had always wondered about the family financial dynamics, but had never felt comfortable asking questions. 2 aunts admitted they had been concerned about how much money I seemed to be giving my family, but had assumed I was wealthy enough to afford such generosity. The most validating response came from my Uncle Tom, Dad's younger brother, who called within an hour of receiving the documentation. He told me that he had suspected something was wrong for years, particularly after conversations with Dad about my supposed willingness to fund family expenses. Tom had found it strange that a young woman just starting her career would have such substantial resources available for other people's needs, but he had never had enough information to understand what was really happening. Uncle Tom also shared information that helped me understand how my parents had been using
My reputation for their own benefit. Apparently, Dad had been bragging to his colleagues at the bank about having a daughter who was so successful and generous that she regularly helped with major family expenses. He had positioned himself as someone who had raised children with exceptional character and financial acumen, using my forced sacrifices to enhance his own professional reputation. As the morning progressed, the consequences began escalating beyond what I had anticipated. Margaret called to inform me that my parents had attempted to contact her office multiple times, demanding immediate meetings and threatening their own legal action for what they were calling harassment and invasion of privacy. Their panic was evident in their increasingly frantic voicemails, where they alternated between denying the allegations and demanding to know how I had obtained their private documents. The professional consequences were also unfolding faster than expected. Dad's supervisor at the bank had called an emergency meeting to discuss the allegations of financial fraud, particularly given that his position involved handling other people's money.
Mom's real estate firm had immediately suspended her pending an internal investigation since the documentation showed she had been using client information and professional resources to research my financial situation. But the most satisfying consequence was entirely unexpected. Around noon, I received a call from someone named Jennifer Walsh, who identified herself as Kevin's older sister. She explained that she had heard about the legal documents delivered to Kevin's workplace and wanted to understand what was happening with her brother's family. Jennifer's call led to the most illuminating conversation of the entire day. She told me that she had been concerned about Kevin and Rachel's lifestyle for months, wondering how they could afford their expensive house, new cars, and frequent vacations on Kevin's modest salary from the marketing agency. When she had asked Kevin directly about their finances, he had been evasive, mentioning something about family support that helped with major expenses. More importantly, Jennifer revealed that Rachel had been pressuring Kevin to ask his own family for money to help with ongoing expenses related to their new house. According to Jennifer, Rachel had convinced Kevin that it was normal for young couples to receive substantial financial assistance from both sets of parents, and she couldn't understand why his family wasn't being as supportive as hers had been. This revelation helped me understand that my parents' theft wasn't just about giving Rachel a house. It was about establishing a pattern where family money would continue flowing toward her lifestyle indefinitely. They had created a system where Rachel expected to receive regular financial support, and they needed my resources to fund that support without depleting their own retirement savings. Jennifer also shared that Kevin had been increasingly uncomfortable with their financial situation, particularly after learning about the true cost of maintaining their new house. The property taxes, insurance, utilities, and maintenance expenses were significantly higher than their previous apartment, and Rachel had been pressuring him to ask for additional family assistance to cover these ongoing costs. According to Jennifer, Kevin had been planning to have a serious conversation with Rachel about downsizing to something more affordable, but Rachel had dismissed his concerns by saying that family financial support would continue as needed. She had apparently assured him that money would never be a problem because her parents had access to resources through me that could cover any shortfalls in their budget. This conversation made me realize that my exposure plan was providing benefits beyond simple justice and financial recovery. It was also potentially saving Kevin from being trapped in a financial situation that would have required ongoing exploitation of both his family and mine. By exposing the true source of their house down payment and the systematic nature of the theft, I was forcing them to confront the reality of their actual financial capacity. As the afternoon progressed, the social consequences of my revelations began creating a ripple effect throughout my parents' community. Several family friends called to express their shock and support, sharing stories about their own observations of our family dynamics that they had never felt comfortable discussing. The picture that emerged was of a family where the parents had been systematically exploiting their more successful daughter while publicly taking credit for her supposed generosity. One particularly revealing call came from Mrs. Davidson, a longtime family friend who had known us since Rachel and I were children. She told me that she had always found it troubling how my parents talked about my financial contributions to the family, particularly their tendency to frame my sacrifices as evidence of their excellent parenting rather than acknowledging the personal cost to me. Mrs. Davidson also shared that she had overheard conversations between my parents and other family friends where they had discussed my earning potential and career prospects in ways that seemed more focused on what I could provide for the family than on my personal happiness and success. She had found these conversations uncomfortable, but hadn't known how to address her concerns without seeming intrusive. The revelation that shocked me most came from my cousin Sarah, who called in tears after reading the documentation I had sent her. She confessed that my parents had approached her family 6 months ago about what they called a family investment opportunity that would involve pooling resources to help young family members with major life expenses. According to Sarah, my parents had presented this as a formal family financial planning strategy, explaining that families like ours needed to coordinate their resources to help the next generation succeed in an increasingly expensive economy. They had specifically mentioned that I was already participating in this coordinated approach and had been very generous in supporting Rachel's home ownership goals. Sarah's family had ultimately decided not to participate, primarily because they were uncomfortable with the level of financial disclosure and coordination that my parents were requesting. But the conversation had left them with the impression that I was voluntarily and enthusiastically funding major expenses for other family members as part of some larger family financial strategy. This revelation helped me understand that my parents' theft wasn't just about giving Rachel a house, it was about establishing a pattern where my family money would continue flowing toward her lifestyle indefinitely. They had created a system where Rachel expected to receive regular financial support, and they needed my resources to fund that support without depleting their own retirement savings. They had been positioning themselves as the generators of this financial support while concealing the fact that my resources were the true source of their family generosity.
Coordinators of family financial planning, using my forced participation as evidence that this approach was both successful and morally appropriate. As evening approached, the consequences of my exposure plan were becoming overwhelming, even for me to track. My phone was constantly buzzing with calls and messages from family members, friends, and even some professional contacts who had received the documentation. The story was spreading through our extended network faster than I had anticipated, creating a comprehensive collapse of my parents' and Rachel's social and professional reputations. Margaret called with an update on the legal front that was equally dramatic. My parents had hired their own attorney who had already reached out to discuss potential settlement negotiations. Their lawyer had made it clear that they were very concerned about the criminal charges that could be filed and were interested in negotiating a resolution that would avoid prosecution. Even more significantly, the bank where Dad worked had placed him on administrative leave pending their own investigation into the allegations of financial fraud. His position as a manager handling other people's money made the charges particularly serious from his employer's perspective, and they were required to investigate any allegations of theft or financial misconduct immediately. Mom's real estate firm had taken similar action, suspending her real estate license pending resolution of the allegations. The documentation showing that she had used her professional resources to research my financial situation and coordinate the theft created potential violations of professional ethics standards that could permanently damage her career. But perhaps the most satisfying consequence was a call I received from Rachel herself, the first direct communication I had received from any of them since implementing my plan. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her words, but the general message was clear. She was begging me to stop what she called my campaign of destruction against the family. Rachel's call revealed the complete collapse of the confident, entitled persona she had displayed during our recent family dinners. She was panicked about the potential loss of her house, terrified about Kevin's reaction to learning the true source of their down payment, and desperate about the social humiliation she was experiencing as friends and colleagues learned about her participation in the theft. Most importantly, she was beginning to understand that her comfortable lifestyle had been built on systematic exploitation of her sister, and that the foundation of her financial security was crumbling as the truth emerged. The house she had been so proud of, the furnishings she had bought with my stolen money, the social status she had enjoyed as a homeowner, all of it was revealed as the product of theft and manipulation. I listened to her sobbing apologies and desperate pleas for forgiveness without saying much in response. When she finally asked what it would take for me to stop pursuing legal action and sharing information about what had happened, I gave her the answer I had prepared for this moment. I explained that the full $75,000 needed to be returned to my account within 48 hours, along with interest and penalties calculated by my forensic accountant. Additionally, I wanted formal, written acknowledgement of their theft and systematic exploitation, signed by all three of them and notarized by an independent party. But most importantly, I told her, I wanted complete cessation of contact from all of them permanently. No more family dinners, no more holiday gatherings, no more attempts to involve me in family financial planning or crisis management.
They had shown me exactly how they viewed me and what they had planned for my future, and I was choosing to build my life without people who saw me as a resource rather than a person. Rachel's response was exactly what I had expected, a desperate attempt to negotiate partial compliance while preserving some ongoing relationship that would allow them to continue accessing my resources in the future. She offered to return $50,000 immediately while making payments on the rest, suggested that we could work through our family issues with counseling, and promised that nothing like this would ever happen again. I told her that my terms were non-negotiable and that she had 48 hours to comply completely or face the full consequences of criminal prosecution and civil litigation. Then I hung up and blocked her number along with my parents' numbers on both my phone and all social media accounts. The next 2 days passed in a strange mixture of tension and relief. The tension came from waiting to see whether they would comply with my demands or attempt to fight the allegations and continue their manipulation tactics. The relief came from finally being free of their constant pressure, guilt trips, and financial emergencies that always seemed to require my immediate attention and resources. Michael was incredibly supportive throughout this period, handling practical matters like changing our phone number and increasing security at our apartment building, while I processed the emotional aftermath of cutting ties with my family permanently. He never once suggested that I was being too harsh or that I should consider reconciliation. Instead, he helped me understand that healthy families don't require their members to sacrifice their financial security for the benefit of others. On the second day, Margaret called with news that brought the legal aspects of the situation to a close. My parents had agreed to full restitution and had signed formal acknowledgments of their systematic theft and fraud. The $75,000 had been transferred to my account, along with additional funds covering interest, penalties, and my legal expenses. More importantly, they had signed comprehensive non-contact agreements that legally prohibited them from attempting to communicate with me or access any information about my financial situation. Violation of these agreements would result in immediate criminal prosecution and additional financial penalties. The signed acknowledgments were particularly satisfying to read. In formal legal language, my parents and Rachel had admitted to systematic financial exploitation, unauthorized access to my bank accounts, theft of wedding funds, tax fraud related to claiming my money as deductible gifts, and conspiracy to establish ongoing control over my financial resources. Their own signatures on these documents ensured that they could never deny or minimize what they had done. But the most meaningful outcome wasn't the financial recovery or the legal vindication. It was the sense of personal empowerment that came from finally standing up for myself and establishing
boundaries that protected my future. For the first time in my adult life, I was free from the constant pressure to sacrifice my own financial security for other people's poor decisions and entitlement. 3 months later, Michael and I were married in a small ceremony at Zilker Park Botanical Garden, surrounded by 25 people who genuinely cared about our happiness and success. The ceremony cost $8,000, paid for entirely with money I had earned and saved myself, without any contributions or interference from family members who viewed my resources as their emergency fund. The wedding was everything I had actually wanted: intimate, personal, and focused on celebrating our commitment to building a life together based on mutual respect and support. There were no dramatic family politics, no last-minute crises requiring financial intervention, no relatives who attended primarily to maintain social appearances rather than celebrate our happiness. 6 months after our wedding, I received a letter forwarded through Margaret's office from Rachel. She had apparently been required to sell the house she had purchased with my stolen money, unable to afford the ongoing expenses without continued family financial support. She and Kevin had moved into a modest apartment that fit their actual budget, and she was reportedly in therapy to address what she described as her financial entitlement issues. The letter was an attempt to apologize for her behavior and request permission to reestablish some form of limited contact, but I never responded. The person who had systematically participated in stealing my money while expressing gratitude for my generosity was not someone I was interested in knowing, regardless of whatever insights therapy might have provided her. My parents had faced their own consequences.
Dad had ultimately been terminated from his position at the bank after their internal investigation confirmed the financial fraud allegations. Mom had lost her real estate license and was working in retail while attempting to rebuild her professional reputation. According to family members who still maintain contact with them, they had been forced to dip into their retirement savings to cover their legal expenses and the restitution they owed me. But perhaps the most significant consequence was the complete collapse of their social reputation within our extended family and community. The documentation I had shared had permanently altered how people viewed them, transforming their image from successful parents who had raised generous children into manipulative individuals who had systematically exploited their own daughter's success. The ripple effects of my exposure plan had also protected other family members from similar exploitation. Several cousins reached out to thank me for revealing the pattern, explaining that they had been approached with similar family investment opportunities that they now understood were attempts to expand the systematic theft to include additional victims. Today, as I write the story, Michael and I are living in a house we purchased together, using money we saved ourselves over 2 years of careful planning and budgeting. Our financial decisions are based on our own goals and values, rather than pressure from family members who view our success as their emergency fund. We're building wealth that belongs to us, planning for a future that reflects our own priorities and dreams. The $75,000 I recovered from my family became the foundation for our financial independence. Combined with our disciplined saving and careful investing, it allowed us to achieve home ownership years earlier than we had originally planned. More importantly, it taught me that financial boundaries aren't just about money. They're about self-respect, autonomy, and the right to build your own life without interference from people who prioritize their comfort over your well-being. I occasionally wonder what would have happened if I had chosen the path of forgiveness and reconciliation that the old Emma would have preferred. Would my parents have eventually stopped their systematic theft? Would Rachel have learned to live within her means without external financial support? Would our family relationships have eventually become healthy and respectful? But I've come to understand that these questions are irrelevant. People who are capable of systematically stealing from their own family members while documenting their plans to continue that exploitation indefinitely aren't people who change through gentle confrontation or boundary setting. They're people who continue their behavior until they face consequences significant enough to make that behavior impossible to continue. The most important lesson I learned from this experience wasn't about family dynamics or financial planning. It was about the difference between being loved and being useful. For years, I had confused my family's appreciation for my financial contributions with genuine affection and respect. I had believed that their praise for my generosity reflected their love for me as a person, when it actually reflected their appreciation for me as a resource. Real love doesn't require endless financial sacrifice. Real family doesn't treat successful members as emergency funding sources. Real relationships are built on mutual respect, reciprocity, and genuine concern for each other's well-being and autonomy. The family I chose, starting with Michael and extending to the friends who supported me through this ordeal, has shown me what healthy relationships actually look like. These are people who celebrate my success without trying to benefit from it financially, who support my goals without attempting to redirect my resources toward their own priorities, who love me for who I am, rather than what I can provide. Building a life based on these principles hasn't always been easy, but it's been infinitely more satisfying than the exhausting cycle of crisis management and financial sacrifice that characterized my relationship with my birth family. I've learned that some relationships are worth fighting for, and others are worth fighting to escape. Today, our savings account balance reflects money we earned together, decisions we made together, and goals we're pursuing together. There are no unauthorized withdrawals, no family emergencies that require immediate financial intervention, no pressure to prioritize other people's dreams over our own financial security. The woman who discovered the theft of her wedding fund 18 months ago would barely recognize the person I've become. That woman was conditioned to prioritize family harmony over personal justice, to sacrifice her own financial security for other people's poor decisions, and accept exploitation as evidence of her own generous character. The person I am today understands that generosity is only meaningful when it's freely chosen.
Family love shouldn't require financial martyrdom,
and that some betrayals are too profound to forgive or forget. Most importantly, I've learned that the most radical act of self-love is refusing to participate in your own exploitation, regardless of how that refusal might disappoint people who have benefited from your previous compliance. Building a life of authentic freedom and genuine security required cutting ties with people who had systematically undermined both, but it was the best decision I ever made. The family I was born into taught me what I didn't want in my relationships. The family I chose has shown me what real love and support actually look like. And that difference has made all the struggle, all the pain, and all the difficult decisions completely worthwhile. The courthouse steps felt like the most symbolic place in the world as I walked down them with Margaret by my side, carrying the final legal documents that officially closed the last chapter of my relationship with my birth family. The restraining orders had been made permanent, the financial restitution was complete, and the criminal charges had been formally resolved through their guilty pleas and community service sentences. After 8 months of legal proceedings, I was finally free. The autumn air in downtown Austin carried the scent of barbecue from food trucks and the distant sound of live music that seemed to perpetually drift through the city. Michael was waiting for us at the bottom of the steps, his face breaking into a relieved smile as he saw the satisfied expression on my face. We had planned at this moment for weeks, knowing that once the legal proceedings were complete, we could finally begin building our future without the constant shadow of family drama and potential retaliation hanging over us. Margaret shook my hand with the kind of firm grip that conveyed both professional satisfaction and personal respect. Over the months we had worked together, she had become more than just my attorney. She had become a mentor who taught me that standing up for yourself wasn't selfish or vindictive, but necessary for maintaining your dignity and autonomy. Her final advice was simple but profound. Never apologize for protecting yourself from people who have proven they don't respect your boundaries. The drive home through Austin's winding streets gave me time to reflect on how dramatically my life had changed since that afternoon when I discovered my stolen wedding fund. The woman who had made that discovery would barely recognize the person I had become. Where there had once been automatic compliance and people-pleasing, there was now careful consideration of what I owed others versus what I owed myself. Where there had once been guilt about setting boundaries, there was now understanding that healthy relationships required mutual respect and reciprocity. Our new house sat in a quiet neighborhood near Barton Creek, a modest but beautiful home that we had purchased entirely with our own resources. Every payment, every repair, every improvement represented money we had earned and saved together, without interference from family members who felt entitled to redirect our financial resources toward their own priorities. The sense of ownership and security was unlike anything I'd experienced before. Michael had taken the day off from his engineering firm to celebrate what we were calling our Independence Day, the official end of the legal proceedings that had consumed so much of our time and emotional energy over the past months. We had planned a quiet celebration at home, just the two of us, reflecting on how much we had accomplished and planning for the future we were now free to build without external interference. As we sat on our back patio that evening, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, I thought about the unexpected ways that confronting my family's theft had transformed every aspect of my life. The obvious changes were financial. We now had substantial savings, owned our home, and were building wealth at a rate that would have been impossible if I had continued funding other people's poor decisions and lifestyle choices. But the deeper changes were psychological and emotional. For the first time in my adult life, I felt truly autonomous, making decisions based on my own values and priorities, rather than pressure from family members who had weaponized guilt and obligation to control my behavior. The constant anxiety that had characterized my relationship with my birth family had been replaced by a sense of calm confidence that came from knowing I could trust my own judgment and protect my own interests. The transformation hadn't been without costs, of course. Several extended family members had chosen to maintain relationships with my parents and Rachel, rather than acknowledge the systematic nature of their theft and manipulation. Some cousins and family friends had expressed disappointment that I couldn't find a way to forgive and reconcile, apparently believing that family harmony was more important than financial justice and personal boundaries. But these losses had been more than offset by the discovery of who my real allies were. Uncle Tom had become a regular presence in our lives, often joining us for dinner and sharing stories about his own struggles with family members who felt entitled to his success. Several cousins had reached out to thank me for exposing patterns they had suspected but never been able to prove. And some had shared their own stories of financial manipulation that my revelations had helped them recognize and address. Most surprisingly, I had received messages from complete strangers who'd heard about my situation through various social connections and wanted to share their own experiences with family financial abuse. These conversations had opened my eyes to how common this type of exploitation was, particularly among families where one member achieved significantly more financial success than others. These connections had led to my involvement with a support group for adults dealing with financial abuse from family members, where I eventually became a volunteer mentor, helping others develop strategies for protecting themselves from systematic exploitation. The skills I had learned during my own legal battle, from documentation and evidence gathering to boundary setting and strategic planning, proved valuable in helping others navigate similar situations. Working with other victims of family financial abuse had taught me that my parents' and Rachel's behavior followed predictable patterns that were remarkably consistent across different families and economic backgrounds. The entitled family member who created constant crises requiring financial intervention, the enabling parents who volunteered their successful child's resources as solutions, and the systematic gaslighting that made decide swings between hypervigilance and self-doubt seem inherent to the relationship.
Victims feel selfish for wanting to keep their own money, the elaborate justifications that reframed theft as family planning. Understanding these patterns had helped me recognize that nothing I could have done differently would have prevented or resolved the systematic exploitation I had experienced. The problem wasn't my failure to communicate effectively or set appropriate boundaries earlier. The problem was that I was dealing with people who fundamentally didn't respect my autonomy or view my resources as truly belonging to me. This recognition had been crucial in overcoming the lingering guilt and self-doubt that had plagued me during the early months after cutting contact with my birth family. There had been moments when I wondered if I was being too harsh, if there might have been some way to preserve the relationships while establishing better boundaries, if my response had been disproportionate to their actions. But working with other victims had shown me the futility of trying to maintain relationships with people who view you primarily as a resource rather than a person. The fundamental worldview that allows someone to systematically steal from their own family members while documenting plans for ongoing exploitation isn't something that changes through gentle confrontation or boundary setting. It's something that continues until it becomes impossible to continue. The most profound validation of my decision had come 6 months after the legal proceedings concluded, when I received a call from Kevin. Rachel's husband had finally decided to leave her after discovering the full extent of her financial manipulation and sense of entitlement. According to Kevin, the loss of their house and the social humiliation of having their theft exposed had not led Rachel to develop better financial habits or more realistic expectations. Instead, she had become increasingly demanding and manipulative, pressuring Kevin to ask his own family for money to fund a lifestyle she felt entitled to maintain despite their actual income level. When his family declined to provide ongoing financial support, Rachel had accused them of being selfish and unsupportive, apparently believing that family members had an obligation to fund her preferences regardless of their own financial situations or priorities. Kevin's call had revealed that Rachel was already in a new relationship with someone she had met through online dating, apparently attracted to his higher income level and willingness to pay for expensive restaurants and weekend trips that Kevin couldn't afford. According to Kevin, she had learned nothing from the consequences of her theft and manipulation, instead focusing her efforts on finding new sources of financial support rather than developing the skills and habits necessary for financial independence. This information had reinforced my understanding that cutting contact completely had been the right decision.
People who are capable of systematic financial exploitation aren't people who learn from consequences and develop healthier relationship patterns. They're people who find new victims and more sophisticated manipulation tactics when their previous methods stop working. The contrast between Rachel's continued pattern of financial exploitation and the healthy financial partnership I had built with Michael couldn't have been more stark. Our relationship was based on mutual respect for each other's autonomy, shared decision-making about major financial choices, and genuine concern for each other's individual goals and well-being alongside our shared objectives as a couple. We had spent considerable time during our first year of marriage discussing and establishing financial boundaries that would protect us from external pressure while allowing us to be generous when we chose to be, rather than when we were expected to be. These conversations had led to formal agreements about how we would handle requests for financial assistance from family members, friends, or charitable organizations. Our approach was based on the principle that generosity should always be freely chosen rather than extracted through guilt, manipulation, or pressure. We established specific criteria for financial assistance that included the recipient's demonstrated responsibility with money, their genuine inability to resolve the situation through their own resources, and our ability to provide help without compromising our own financial security or long-term goals. Most importantly, we agreed that any request for financial assistance that came with emotional manipulation, artificial urgency, or attempts to bypass our decision-making process would be automatically declined, regardless of the stated need or relationship with the person making the request. This policy had already proven valuable in protecting us from several attempts by distant relatives and acquaintances to involve us in their financial crises. The financial security we had built through careful planning and boundary setting had allowed us to be genuinely generous in ways that aligned with our values and priorities. We had established a scholarship fund at the local community college for students from low-income families who were pursuing degrees in marketing and engineering. We regularly donated to organizations that supported victims of family financial abuse and domestic violence. We had helped several friends with emergency expenses when they faced genuine crises beyond their control. But this generosity was entirely different from the systematic exploitation I had experienced with my birth family. These were voluntary choices made after careful consideration with clear boundaries and realistic expectations about outcomes. There was no ongoing pressure for additional support, no emotional manipulation designed to extract more resources. No assumption that our success created obligations to fund other people's lifestyle choices. The difference between chosen generosity and extracted compliance had become one of the most important distinctions in my understanding of healthy relationships. Real love and genuine family connection didn't require endless financial sacrifice or the surrender of personal autonomy. Healthy relationships were built on mutual respect, reciprocity, and concern for each other's individual well-being alongside shared goals and commitments. These principles had guided our approach to building new family connections based on choice rather than obligation. Michael's family had welcomed me with warmth and genuine affection that asked nothing beyond participation in shared experiences and mutual care during difficult times. His parents had shown me what family support looked like when it flowed both ways, when success was celebrated rather than exploited, when individual achievements were valued for their own sake rather than for their potential to solve other people's problems.
Values around financial responsibility and mutual respect. These relationships provided the sense of community and belonging that I had always hoped to find with my birth family, but based on genuine compatibility and shared values, rather than genetic connections and guilt-based obligations. The social events we attended now were characterized by authentic joy and celebration, rather than the undercurrent of financial pressure and hidden agendas that had characterized family gatherings with my parents and Rachel. People celebrated each other's successes without immediately calculating how those successes could benefit them personally. Conversations about money were straightforward and honest rather than manipulative and strategically designed to extract resources. As I reflected on these changes during our quiet celebration evening, I realized that the theft of my wedding fund had been both the worst and best thing that had ever happened to me. It was the worst because it had forced me to confront the reality that people I loved and trusted had been systematically exploiting me for years while documenting their plans to continue that exploitation indefinitely. But it was also the best because it had forced me to develop the strength and skills necessary to protect myself from people who didn't respect my boundaries or value my autonomy. It had taught me the difference between being loved and being useful, between family connection and family exploitation, between generous choice and manipulative extraction. Most importantly, it had freed me to build the kind of life and relationships I actually wanted, rather than the ones I felt obligated to maintain. The fear of disappointing people who viewed me primarily as a resource had been replaced by the confidence that came from surrounding myself with people who valued me as a person. Michael reached for my hand as we sat watching the stars appear in the darkening sky above our backyard. The simple gesture carried weight that went far beyond physical contact. It represented the kind of partnership where support flowed naturally in both directions, where individual success was celebrated rather than exploited, where personal boundaries were respected rather than violated. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities and challenges, new decisions about how to use our resources and time, new chances to build the kind of future we wanted rather than the kind others expected us to fund. But tonight was for celebrating how far we had come and acknowledging the courage it had taken to choose authenticity over compliance, self-respect over family harmony. The woman who had discovered her stolen wedding fund 18 months ago would be amazed by the life we had built through careful planning, firm boundaries, and the willingness to prioritize our own well-being over other people's comfort with our decisions. That woman had been conditioned to believe that her value came from her willingness to sacrifice for others. The person I had become understood that real value came from the strength to protect what you had built and the wisdom to share it only with people who truly deserved your trust. 6 months later, as I was organizing our financial documents for tax season, I came across the original bank statements showing the theft of my wedding fund. Looking at those numbers now, what struck me most wasn't the anger or hurt I had initially felt, but gratitude for the clarity that discovery had provided. Those stolen $75,000 had bought me something far more valuable than any wedding could have provided. The knowledge of my own strength, the ability to distinguish between authentic love and manipulative exploitation, and the confidence to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. The money had been returned with interest, but more importantly, the experience had taught me lessons about autonomy, boundaries, and self-respect that would protect me for the rest of my life. I had learned that some relationships were worth fighting for, others were worth fighting to escape, and the wisdom to distinguish between the two was perhaps the most valuable skill anyone could develop. Today, our savings account reflects money we earned together, decisions we made together, and goals we're pursuing together. There are no unauthorized withdrawals, no family emergencies requiring immediate financial intervention, no pressure to prioritize other people's dreams over our own financial security. The future stretches ahead of us filled with possibilities that belong entirely to us, unburdened by the expectations and entitlements of people who confused our success with their opportunity. We're building wealth that serves our values, relationships that honor our autonomy, and a legacy that reflects our own choices rather than other people's manipulation. And every day, I'm grateful for the strength it took to claim that future, even when it meant disappointing people who had never truly valued me as anything more than a convenient source of funding for their own dreams and mistakes. The theft of my wedding fund had been intended to finance someone else's house, but it had ended up purchasing something far more valuable: my freedom to live authentically, love genuinely, and build a future that truly belonged to me.